Okay, that's it.
Yeah. Right, the technology is working. Good evening, and thank you very much for coming to hear about what we've been doing in critical thinking. Some of you will be familiar with what we do, but for those who don't, critical thinking started about 4 years ago. It came out of the Occupy movement, Tent City University, and the Free University. And essentially it's a collaborative educational project. It's non-hierarchical, there are no teachers, there are no students. We work together to try and get to answers about the way the world works. We don't have any preconceived, or we didn't start with any preconceived ideas of what we were going to find. We were obviously very conscious that the world is not working. What we're trying to understand is why. So what we're presenting tonight is a snapshot of where we've got to. And this is work that is contributed by huge numbers of people. Although we're a group in London, we're interacting with many other groups. We're drawing on lots of other work that's been done both contemporaneously and historically. So it's actually millions of man-hours that has gone into what you're going to see, although you're going to see a very superficial aerial view of it. And I'm afraid it's quite intense because there's a lot of ground to cover. If you're on the net, then you can download the handouts, which are at freecriticalthinking.org. There's an events page, and there's a handout which gives you the slides plus a few notes and a few references, which, if you're interested in following up what you see here tonight, then that's the way to start. So, why critical thinking? What becomes apparent, and I think it's no surprise to anyone in this room, is that the levers of power are concentrated in very few hands. So the media, law, government, corporations, education, think tanks, institutions, religion, NGOs, they're all controlled by the same small number of people. And what we're trying to discover is why that is, why that should be the way it is. Because these levers of power act as a barrier to truth, because we're being told things that just patently aren't true. And if you watch what's going on long enough, it's very obvious that what you're being told is not true. Now, the first question to ask oneself is, how did this small group of people come to get all this power? And it would seem to us that actually what we have is a problem that emerged many, many years ago, when man first began to congregate into civilizations with the emergence of hierarchy. And our research suggests that it was at the point of surplus, when by using primitive tools there was an agricultural surplus, that a few individuals or groups managed to gain control of that surplus and set the rules, if you like, for everybody else. This particular aspect of our work is based on The Ecology of Freedom by a man called Murray Bookchin, which I would urge you to get hold of. It's not a particularly easy read, but it's full of interesting challenges to the way we think about where we've got to today. He originally was a Marxist. He tore up his Communist Party card in 1945, and he's really urging us to look at decentralization. And his ideas are what forms the basis of the way the PKK, the Kurdish separatist movement, organized themselves. So the domination of nature led to the domination of humans and concentrated this power into very few hands and the wealth, and created this system of competition. Now we can try and imagine how this emergence of a hierarchy began. And you think about the old, when you're young and vital, it seems in pre-literate society there was no particular age hierarchy. But obviously, as the old became infirm, they were obviously concerned about how they would survive, whether they'd be left just to sort of rot. And so, because they had the experience of seeing the seasons and phenomena, weather and stars, then they could use their wisdom, if you like, to develop some sort of status within the tribal group, leading to an age hierarchy, which persists today. And then it's quite likely that some of those, by relating that to their imagination, began to talk about the spiritual world, and they became shaman. And from shaman you get to sort of organized religion and theology, and priests mediating between the divine and man. So that's another form of hierarchy. As groups came into contact with each other, then the question of defense began to be an issue, and so you see an emerging warrior class who effectively turned from being defensive to being aggressive. And that in turn, I suspect, led to the gender division, might is right, and therefore the men accrued more power, and we turned into sort of patriarchal societies. This is not exclusively the case, and there were obviously matriarchal societies as well, but that seems to be the general drift. But probably the biggest factor in the way that we've developed these hierarchies, these institutional hierarchies, is specialization, where increasingly people have moved from being amateurs into being professionals. And it's now taken to an almost ridiculous extreme. If you think about professional football, it was a game that probably started as a means of entertainment and enjoyment, and it's turned into this narcissistic, hugely unequal diversion and distraction, which absorbs huge amounts of resources, attention, and distraction. So this is the way we suspect that hierarchy has emerged, the process, and it's created this sort of move from communal simplicity. As we get to the agricultural surplus and specialization and complexity, there's an increasing desire to make people conform. There's obviously competition and conflict, but ultimately it's all about control. Who is in control? So I don't think it's been any different. If you go back to the early days, it's all about farming humanity. In other words, they moved on, the structural elite, the people that gained the control of the surplus, they moved on from farming land and livestock into farming other humans, which is much more profitable. Now, initially it starts by force, obviously through slavery, and that is obviously fairly obvious what's going on. Then you get into coercion. So if you think about the Industrial Revolution, where there were enclosures, people were forced off the land, that forced them into factories, and being forced into factories is a form of coercion, because if you don't go to work in the factory, you starve. But as we move, obviously through the sort of early 20th century, there was some reclamation of power amongst the working class, because there were a large number of them, and therefore you get the labour and socialist movements, which began to roll back some of the iniquities of the Industrial Revolution. But it didn't last very long, and the reason it didn't last very long is because we then get to a situation where conditioning is used. And I would urge you to study the work of Edward Bernays, who's really the father of propaganda. He wrote a book called Propaganda, and seemed quite sort of proud of it. But actually, if you look, there's a BBC series by Adam Curtis called The Century of the Self. And it takes you through the process of how we were turned into people who had needs into people who had desires, and the way we've been conditioned with increasing sophistication to conform with the system. Because if you don't conform, then your survival is in question. So there are various forms of conditioning. So this is a representation of chemtrails. Now, chemtrails are a conspiracy theory, or they were, but now they're openly discussed in the context of climate change. And this is quite interesting, because if you go back to the Vietnam War, weather manipulation was used within the Vietnam War, and it's been used ever since. So there are, in some senses, this weather manipulation may be to provoke these extreme weather events to support the thesis of climate change. That's one possibility. There are other possibilities because they're dumping huge amounts of toxic metals into the sky. And these things could account for the increase in Alzheimer's, for example. And there is scientific evidence all over the world that this is going on. And yet it's not something that's ever discussed in the sort of mainstream, either by governments, but it is beginning to be discussed in terms of geoengineering for climate change, pretending that they're about to do it or have only just started doing it, whereas in fact, I grew up on airfields. My father was in the Air Force, and I've been studying aeroplanes for a long, long time, and this started in the late 90s. And the skies that we see today are nothing like the skies that I remember from my youth. Education through the schools. There's a man called John Taylor Gatto who was 30 years, he was a teacher, he was an award-winning teacher, and he said he gave up teaching because he couldn't hurt children anymore. And he talks about how you can't train fleas until you break their will. And he talks about you get a Petri dish, you put a load of fleas in there, if you don't put a lid on them, they'll all jump off and they'll set their own agenda and do what they want to do. You put the lid on, leave them for 2 hours, take the lid off, they won't move. You can then train them. That's what we're doing to children. This represents predictive programming. I don't know how many of you have heard of Tom Secker, but he's done a lot of work on the 7/7 bombings in London. And he talks about predictive programming. And if you're a, excuse me, Beavis and Butthead fan, there was in the 1990s a cartoon in Beavis and Butthead magazine which showed the Twin Towers with 2 Arabs in aeroplanes flying into them. And yet we are told they never imagined that people would fly aeroplanes into buildings. Another instance of predictive programming, particularly relevant to 7/7, is that the BBC series Spooks contained various elements in the plot lines before 2005 that related Muslim extremists, Islam bombers, to what actually happened on 7/7/2005. So that is predictive programming, and it's going on all the time in Hollywood, in TV, everywhere. The image this side is representing MKUltra, which was a secret CIA program to manipulate through, in its early days, there's a guy called Dave McGowan who wrote a book, escapes my memory, but it's something like Strange Things in the Canyon. But he talks about suddenly all these people appeared in Laurel Canyon with massive amounts of LSD on tap. And Timothy Leary, who was some sort of protege of one of the banking families, seemed to be dispensing this stuff at parties. It was freely available. And part of the rationale may have been to reduce some of the opposition to the Vietnam War. If people were getting stoned, tuning in, turning on, dropping out, then obviously the Vietnam War protests would be somewhat debilitated. But there are many other manifestations. There are, if you look at what happened to Britney Spears, who went through this rather dramatic breakdown, it's quite likely she was subject to MKUltra. It was supposedly ceased in the 90s. All that happened is it went underground. It's still going on today. Vaccines and drugs. We're obviously drugging kids in schools, the number of kids on Ritalin and all these various drugs to try and control behaviour. If you don't conform, you get drugged. But it's particularly relevant or topical at the moment if you think about the Zika virus. Now, you go back a couple of years, what were we all terrified of? Ebola. Ebola was a big hoo-ha about this. Millions were going to be infected, and if you remember, they were talking about closing borders. Well, it was all about vaccinations. And I'm not going to go into any detail, but if you look at the Zika virus, the Brazilian researchers who are actually looking at the incidence of this microcephaly in newborn babies, there aren't 4,000 cases as reported in the mainstream media. They have actually identified 404 cases in Brazil. This was a week or two ago, according to the latest numbers. Of those 404, only 17 had symptoms of the Zika virus. What had happened in Brazil is that there was a mass vaccination of pregnant women of TDAP, and it's quite likely that could be related. There is an additional factor which may or may not be related, but adds to the sort of mix of obfuscation, is that they introduced GMO mosquitoes, genetically modified mosquitoes, allegedly to eradicate dengue fever. Now, the fact that this Zika virus has occurred at the same time may be related, but it's speculation. But certainly what you're being told in the media about millions of deaths from Zika is complete hogwash. And lastly, of course, we have the media, which is the ultimate conditioning machine. Everybody has a TV in the corner of their room, and basically that's where they get their information, their instructions, how to think, how to behave, etc. Now, I mentioned education. One of the biggest factors in all of this, the reason that the media can put out what it does is because it uses talking heads, so-called experts with PhDs or degrees who are experts in this, that and the other. And this comes back to the specialization. Information is siloed, so everybody has to take information from other people on trust. And this control of academia, that basically this small handful of people, they set the agenda for Harvard, MIT, Oxford, Cambridge. All of these are endowed. Economics has been totally decimated in terms of, they're not taught economics. I think I met Steve Keen and had a conversation with him. He refers to an economics degree as a £21,000 lobotomy. And this is basically what is happening to our education system. So why a free university, which is where we came from? There's a very good reason that we are a free university, because we need to be able to ask any question. We cannot be accountable to somebody for what the questions that we ask. There are no taboos. We have to discover actually what's going on about all those phenomena that we talked about chemtrails and MK Ultra. You go into a mainstream university, you start talking about this stuff. So academia has to be free. It has to be freed from this cabal that basically controls the agenda. So when we obviously were aware of the symptoms, and I think everybody in this room is aware of the symptoms of the problems in the world today. Inequality, economic dysfunction, wars, conflict, environmental destruction, corruption and greed, which is, it's almost acceptable these days that people are corrupt and greedy. Nobody's shocked anymore. I mean, I remember the Profumo affair many years ago, and it was a huge hoo-ha. I'm not saying the world was necessarily better or different then, but certainly there was some shame involved. There is no shame. These people are shameless the way they behave. And I'm not talking about the structural elite at the top necessarily, but the elevated cattle who are doing their bidding. They're like prison trustees who've been given privileges in order to oppress the rest of us, and they are shameless. And of course we have institutional failure. So it's all very well talking about symptoms, but where do they all come from? So what we've been trying to do is look at what are the fundamental root causes, and we've come down to what are essentially three economic flaws. Hierarchy is obviously at the root of it, because hierarchy has determined how the economy or the economic system has been designed to benefit those few at the top. And the first flaw is about land. Now, who knows the game of Monopoly? Who doesn't know the game of Monopoly? The landlord's game, it was called originally, and it was designed by a lady who relied on the work of Henry George, who wrote Progress and Poverty in 1879. And if you play Monopoly, which I'm sure most of us have, we know what happens. The winner takes all. Always. The winner takes everything. And that is the problem with land. Land is God-given or nature-given, depending on your particular view of theology. Nobody can own land. We all were put on this earth with the opportunity and the privilege and the entitlement to share in the fruits of the land, to exploit the land for our survival. So how can we be deprived of it by somebody claiming ownership? And it's the same with other commons. Knowledge. Who can claim knowledge? All that I'm showing you tonight, no one, I can't claim it, critical thinking can't claim it. It's built on millennia of understanding, wisdom and work. So how can we claim knowledge? How can we claim any of the commons, the radio spectrum? All of these things should belong to us all. And the problem is that having been deprived of access to the land, and in this country it manifested itself in the enclosures, and then we started doing it all over the world, we sent our oppressed overseas to steal land off indigenous populations elsewhere. And what that does is remove the means to life. So people were driven into factories. And in the early days, factories were very oppressive. But over time, through social movements, workers' movements, etc., there was some respite as workers' rights were asserted and a living wage. And I would say probably in the post-war era, there was something of a post-war settlement that actually gave most people some sort of decent living. But it wasn't perfect. There were still many losers, and it was only temporary. And the means to life now is no longer dependent. It's dependent on employment, but we don't need the people. Humans need not apply. That's a video online. I urge you to watch it. It's not very long, because basically any job, lawyer, accountant, journalist, all of these jobs can be automated. So there just aren't the jobs, or there aren't going to be the jobs in the future that can make sense of this idea that in order to survive you have to have a job. We have to disassociate the idea that work is somehow your passport to life. And there's a very interesting phenomenon here, because the people at the top, we know who they are, but those people at the top who are near this boundary, they're terrified, because they're terrified they're going to end up like this. And these people in this band here, where they're near this boundary, in other words, where they lose their security, they get made redundant or whatever, some misfortune happens, they get tipped into here. And these people, these at the bottom, they're there to frighten the shit out of everybody else.
Yeah,
and this process is bearing down. More and more people are finding themselves down in these lower levels. So we have to disassociate the means to life from employment. And what we end up with is this precariat, which is just growing.
What's the precariat?
Precariat was a concept developed by a guy called Guy Standing. He's been piloting the idea of a basic income in India using the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA. And he wrote this book a year or two ago and developed this idea of the precariat. And more of us are part of the precariat. There are so many people who don't know how they're going to live. They don't know whether they're going to be working tomorrow. They don't know how long their hours are, no hours contracts. There are many, many people in the precariat. And it's no longer people at the so-called lower levels of society. It affects university lecturers. It affects everybody. So we've talked about the first two flaws, the denial of access to land and the commons, and the means to life being conditional on employment. The last flaw is basically almost the most corrosive of all. And Margaret Kennedy, whose work we drew on for this, describes it as the invisible wrecking machine at the heart of the economic system, and it's interest on money, or as it used to be known, usury. Because usury, or interest, is very interesting. What Margaret Kennedy found was that interest doesn't, we all pay interest. Doesn't matter whether you've got a mortgage or not, or whether you borrow money or not, we all pay interest. When you go and buy a railway ticket, in the cost of the railway ticket is the capital cost of the station, the rolling stock, track, etc. There is an interest element in everything. And with private finance initiative, there's more interest in everything today than there's ever been. So she found that interest doesn't treat us equally. And what she did, she studied the population of West Germany, and she broke it down into what are called deciles, in other words, 10% chunks. And she found that the first 8 deciles, or the bottom 80% by income, paid twice as much income as the interest as they received. So they were paying that much, but they were only receiving this much. Now the 9th decile, which is sort of 80 to 90%, they broke even. Basically what they paid is what they received. But the top 10% received twice as much as they paid. So effectively, all the interest that the bottom 80% were paying went to the top 10%. And inequality is built into the interest system. It's an irreversible inevitability, and attempts to rectify it by taxation are just doomed to fail. We have to attack the source of the problem, which is interest on money. And if that wasn't bad enough, it drives unsustainable debt growth. In other words, you get to a stage where the debt is no longer affordable. Now, what Margaret Kennedy did was she looked at West Germany, which is by no means as financialized as we were then, or much less so than today. I mean, we are more financialized than we've ever been. And she found that between 1968 and 1989, the interest cost of servicing government debt, 1,360 was the interest, and yet the income was only going up, wages by 345% and government income by 423%. So you can see that the interest cost just runs away from income. In driving exponential growth, this is an exponential growth curve. People say that if you, for a developed economy like the UK or Europe, you expect economic growth of 3% per annum. That means the economy has to double every 24 years. That means twice the resources, twice the waste, and it's clearly unsustainable. We just don't have the planets to be able to do that indefinitely. That's a linear curve, but what nature does is more like this. And you remember, you know, we've all grown. We didn't keep growing when we got to 18. Otherwise, we'd be a lot taller than we are today. It levels out. And that's the sort of economic system that we need that delivers growth to the point at which it becomes sustainable, where prosperity and a good living, a well-meaning life actually becomes a viable proposition, not just for the few, but for everybody. There is another corrosive element of, or effect of interest, and that it discounts our future. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, but there's a process by which every project, whether you're going to set up a mine, whether you're going to build a bridge, a road, what accountants used, and we're ruled by accountants in this day and age, they use something called discounted cash flow to calculate future returns, and they discount the future because we demand this time value for money. So what it means is that a forest standing today is worth much less than if we cut it down and turn it into timber. And companies make money by making it faster. So the faster they extract resources, because of the time value of money, the faster they extract the resources, the more money they make. And that's the problem with interest. So it hits us in inequality, it hits us in terms of environment, it hits us in terms of boom and bust. And last but not least, it's the secret key to the bankers' power. This is how they rule the world. In in the Renaissance, there was a chap called Marsilio Ficino, and he translated from the Greek the Corpus Hermeticum, which basically led to the development of double-entry bookkeeping. And double-entry bookkeeping is alchemy, which is the mechanism by which bankers create money. So you go into the bank and you say, I want to borrow, what's a Ferrari these days? I want to borrow £100,000 to buy a Ferrari. There is not £100,000 sitting in the bank ready for you to take away. It is your signature on the piece of paper for the loan that creates that £100,000. And what happens? Double entry bookkeeping. £100,000 goes into your account. £100,000 goes into the bank's account as an asset that they are owed. It's magic, alchemy, creating money from nothing, like so. So, in effect, what we have in the floors, by taking control and appropriating the surplus of the commons from the land and resources and all the other commons where we create the value communally, and by interest, what we have is a very small number of rent seekers who are taking an increasing share of the wealth of the planet, bearing down on the rest of us who are fighting over a diminishing cake. In other words, because the planet is not replenishing itself as quickly as they're using the resources, we're fighting over what's reducing and getting more and more stressed as a result. So, in a nutshell, this is the way the world works. The structural elite control all the levers of power, and they bear down using war, ecocide, division through the media, ideology, socialism versus capitalism, the employed versus the unemployed, indigenous populations versus foreigners, any division you can think of, they will exploit it. And by creating division, they create a war, intelligence, surveillance machine to make more money and extract all the wealth created by the rest of us, 7 billion people on the planet, extracted in terms of rents, taxes and interest. And that all goes back to them. And it's a perfect machine. It just keeps rolling. And we are the feedstock to that machine. And as long as we comply, that machine will keep going. So where did these people come from? We talked about the emergence of hierarchy, and we've talked about the alchemy of banking. Now, in America, after the War of Independence was largely fought because the American population were creating their own currency and the American economy was growing. So not only was William not getting his tax receipts, the bankers weren't participating in all this wonderful growth in the New World. So the American War of Independence was to impose a banking system back on the American colonies. And that's mirrored today in the wars in Iraq, the war in Libya, the war in Syria, the aggression towards Iran, and the aggression towards Russia. These are all countries that have taken control of their own money, or tried to varying degrees of extent. And Andrew Jackson, who I think was elected in 1824, basically managed to kick out the bankers. They had 2 goes at setting up a central bank, both of which were not very good for the population. He described central banks as engines of corruption, and he drove them out. I think the last charter for the central bank lapsed in 1832, something like that. And there was no central bank. Coming into the 20th century, there was no central bank in America. So what the bankers did, and these are largely driven by 8 key families, of which the supreme commander is probably Rothschilds, they basically got together and connived to bring about an economic disaster or collapse in order to foist on the American public a new central bank, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is as federal as Federal Express. It's a private company. It's owned by 8 banking families, and they basically control banking across the world through the privately owned Federal Reserve, which in the dollar world that we live in today, although probably not for much longer, that drives the world, through the Bank of International Settlements, which is also a private bank, all the other it's the central bankers' bank, the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. And basically that's another private bank that controls all the other central banks. So it's central banks that are driving the world as it is today. And there's quite another interesting phenomenon. In 2011, there was a study published in the New Scientist, the first study of its kind. And basically it analysed 43,060 transnational corporations. And it looked at the ownership. It looked at share registers. It looked at common directors. And what it found was that that network of 43,060, of that, 40% of those corporations were controlled by just 147 what they described super entities. In other words, other corporations. And within that 147, among the top 20, there were mainly banks. And of the top 50, 45 were financial organisations, so there were insurers, etc. Now that study didn't look beyond the share register. And there are foundations, nominee companies, offshore trusts, blind trusts, which obscure who actually owns what. This is the way that Rothschilds have hidden their wealth for centuries behind such facades. And they not only controlled 40% of this network, they controlled 60% of the revenues. So in essence, if you control all that corporate power, and we know what corporate power is today, and if that corporate power is colluding under the same ownership, that gives you control of everything. It gives you control of government, it gives you control of academia, it gives you control of media, you control everything. So what we have is the structural elite exercising the levers of power. Obviously, another way of making money is through wars. They back both wars. First World War, Second World War, Vietnam War, all of the wars of the 21st century, they've all been provoked. Invariably, there are false flags involved in order to precipitate the wars that follow. So 9/11 was actually, the wars that followed 9/11 were planned in 1990s and laid out. It's documented for anyone to go and look at in the Project for the New American Century. So there is cause and effect. 9/11 was the Pearl Harbor, the new Pearl Harbor to precipitate the wars that followed. And that has been the case ever since. So who else is in the structural elite? Because it's not just bankers. Structural elites existed long before the bankers invented the alchemy of money. So in amongst the 8 banking families, we also have European royalty, the UK monarchy. We have Dutch royalty, other royalty. We also have industrial dynasties like the Agnellis from Italy. And then you have the political and economic predators, people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, Henry Kissinger, who's been orchestrating geopolitics around the globe for the last 6 decades or more. And then you have the super rich, the likes of Bill Gates, Eric Schmidt of Google. These people have now joined the top table, and they are doing the same sorts of things as the structural elite did before them. So you've got Bill Gates promoting vaccines for population control. And if you don't believe it, go and look on the net. There's a TED Talk where he openly says he loves vaccinations for population control. He couldn't have been more blatant. So this is where the actual power lies. So what we have is a world of hierarchy, and it manifests itself in terms of destruction, fear, and control, and it's based on competition, which leads to scarcity and inequality, and that's self-evident. So what do we do about it? So where we've got to, a lot of this work we did 2 or 3 years ago. What we've been working on in the last year or two is the concept of non-hierarchy. And if you go back to pre-literate societies, before all this process started, their characteristics were community, freedom, diversity, equality, security. And we could actually get that. And when people challenge and say, well, it wouldn't work today, there are usually a number of factors behind that question. One is we must remember that we're all damaged. We've all been conditioned into the way we think that human nature is as it's supposed to be. but human nature is driven by those flaws. We're driven to compete. We're driven to behave aggressively. We're driven to try and cheat our neighbour. And yet, in spite of that, many of us don't. And our natural predilection is actually quite different. And the other main objection is that it'll never work in a complex society like ours today. Now, there's a man called Frederick Laloux, who was a McKinsey consultant, who's been doing a lot of work on non-hierarchical commercial organisations and non-commercial, but not governments. And he took 3 years out, and he identified about a dozen case studies, and he decided that to be legitimate, he had to pick enterprises of size and complexity in order to justify his idea, which is basically that self-managed organisations, non-hierarchical, self-managed organisations could be successful. And he identified a dozen of these. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I would urge you to get hold of his book or watch his video, which is also on Critical Thinking's site, called Reinventing Organisations. And he cites the example of a company called Buurtzorg in Holland. And Buurtzorg does healthcare in the home. In other words, it supports the disabled, the elderly, etc. And before Buurtzorg came along, it was all similar to the sort of bureaucracy that we see within the NHS, where one nurse or attendee would go in to do one thing, to administer something, somebody else would go in to do something else, and they were all on timesheets, they were all demoralised, and it didn't work. Buurtzorg was a reaction to that, and he developed teams, multidisciplinary teams of 12, maximum of 12 people, and they actually worked in groups. And the transformation of the service that they provide, and they involve the families of their patients or customers, as some people call them, in the whole process. And everybody's much happier, and they're getting awards for what they're doing. There's another company which manages power generation around the world. It employs 40,000 people. It's managed on a non-hierarchical basis. And Laloux's thesis is it's precisely complex organisations that are best managed on a self-organising basis. And there's further justification for this in that we've been looking at something called natural inclusion. In other words, looking at our perceptions of how things work. And a lot of our scientific understanding is deficient, and I'm not going to go into it, but essentially if you think about nature, there is no command and control in nature. There's no mechanism at the top saying how things should be. Nature evolves through little independent organisms that are interdependent, and they co-create and they collaborate and they create wonderful things. We as human beings co-create and create wonderful things, but we're working under a system that is oppressive, destructive, and highly divisive. Just think what we could achieve if we actually moved on to the next stage of non-hierarchical collaboration. Now, you may think that pre-literate man knew nothing about hierarchy. And there's a YouTube video with David Graeber, the anthropologist, who I'm sure many of you know. He wrote Debt the First 5,000 Years. And a lot of our work on economics came from his book. But he's on a video interview with a guy talking to another anthropologist called David Wengrow. And they're talking about Paleolithic politics. And essentially, they describe the idea of hierarchy as being something fluid. That there were some tribes that were hierarchical, some that were non-hierarchical. But they were seasonal, they were experimenting, they were going back and forth. So one example is that groups would be devolved into their multitude of groups, and they would be operating on a non-hierarchical, collaborative way. And then every now and again, each season, they would come together and build a city, a temporary city. And they would come together for ritual and for celebration. And hierarchy would develop within that temporary city. And at the end of the celebration and the ritual, they tear it all down and go off back into non-hierarchy. And as David Graeber put it, he said, they'd build it up, they'd tear it down. They'd build it up, they'd tear it down. And then one day, they didn't tear it down. And here we are today. So this hierarchical, institutionalized structure that we have is not an inevitability. And I would say that today, we have a unique opportunity. No generation before us has ever had what we have, which is the access to the huge amount of information. Now, a lot of the information is misinformation, so it takes a lot of work to get to the nuts and bolts of what's really happening. But we also have the ability to communicate across time zones, across geography, and that is unprecedented. So it is feasible for the world to organize itself on a non-hierarchical basis for the first time ever, because we know what they're doing in China. We know what they're doing in Russia. We can talk to people. Has anybody watched YouTubes of Syrian girl talking about the Syrian conflict? We can actually get first-hand from people that are there. We don't necessarily know whether she's genuine. She may or may not be. So we have to look at other sources in order to corroborate what she's saying. But the fact that we can communicate at grassroots level gives us the opportunity to change the way the world goes. And there are all these factors that we have. You know, we are a hell of a lot more than those 150 people who congregate in Bilderberg or the Rothschild family or whatever it may be. But there's one thing that gets in our way, which I'll come on to. But all we've got to do is accept that no man can rule over another man, no woman can rule over another woman, and vice versa, or interchangeably. And that is the first thing that we have to grasp. The Queen sitting in Buckingham Palace is a person. You bring her into this room today, she's no different to you and I. But it's the ideology and the stuff that goes around it that makes her different. That's what we have to strip away. And then we have to deal with those economic flaws. So we have to share the surplus from the commons. We have to give the means to life unconditionally to everybody. Everybody needs their share of the commons as a dividend, not as a basic income, but as a dividend. It's their right. It's their birthright as a human being. And we have to just eradicate this idea of interest on money. But the only drawback is that we've been taught to self-promote. Now, I don't know about you, when I was brought up, if there were people bragging in school, they used to get beaten up and ostracized. But the world has changed. If you don't brag, you don't get. You get ignored, you get sidelined. So you have to go on X Factor or whatever it may be, become the best Premiership footballer in order to justify your existence. We have to recognize that ego is one of our big problems. And this quotation comes from Peter Challen's dad, who, Peter Challen runs Global Table. I'm sure he'll be known to many of you. He's a cleric who's been a jobbing cleric and trying to talk about this sort of stuff for years. And his dad said to him, nothing is impossible if you don't mind who gets the credit. And as long as you need to get your name in lights or on that scientific paper as the person who's come up with the solution, we're never going to find the solution. But as long as we're able to work together and not worry about who gets the credit, we can do this. But we've got to focus on the fact that we are the system. Everything we do feeds this system. So we have to withdraw consent. How do we withdraw consent? Most people in this room have already withdrawn consent to be lied to and to be manipulated. And what we need to do is go beyond that. And what we've started to do just this week is actually to start talking about food. And there's a guy called Mario Molinari that we've begun to talk to about how does one recreate the notion of family within communities. And you start with food, by growing food, by making food in families, in small groups, in your street, inviting the neighbours in to break. He's got this concept of bread and soup. You invite the neighbours in, you make bread and soup, and you eat it, and you begin to discuss all the things that revolve around food. Food cycles, energy cycles, water cycles. If you study those, it brings in every other discipline. We shouldn't be siloing education into maths, physics and chemistry life encompasses all of these. So by starting on food, and this is, if you like, where we've got to in our journey, and we hope to be able to get there over the course of the coming year. But we're going to be hopefully talking to a lot more people and going out and actually doing, as Eddie said. Eddie has been involved with us for getting on for 18 months now. He's an artist, and I'm sure he'll have something to say for himself when we get to discuss. But he came up with this idea of thinking and making, that actually by doing things together and exploring the sorts of ideas that we've talked about tonight, or I've talked about tonight, and we're going to talk some more, I hope, then we begin to develop those communities. Because the way we're going to defeat the system is not by marching on Downing Street, or by throwing bombs, or by any of these things. We have to create something better that draws the energy from this corrosive system and build something so that we won't have to make demands. We just take the power, we'll take the land, we'll take the commons. Yeah. But we have to do it together, and we have to not worry who gets the credit. So thank you very much for listening, and